You ever stand in a place where the air itself seems to remember what happened there? I once did, on a quiet island in the South Pacific, long after the war had gone silent. The palms swayed, the ocean hummed, but underneath it all there was this strange weight, as if the ground still carried echoes of boots, gunfire, and fear. Guadalcanal. The name alone once sent chills through every sailor and soldier who heard it. It was supposed to be a quick operation, a small step on the long road to Japan. But instead it turned into one of the most brutal, soul-draining campaigns of the entire Pacific War, a place where men didn't just fight the enemy. They fought the jungle, the rain, the insects, and their own exhaustion. Before we set foot in that nightmare, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button if you love real history told with heart. And share this story with a friend who thinks they've heard it all about World War II. Because trust me, this one still makes old veterans stare into the distance when they talk about it. Now, imagine the scene. It's August 1942. The Americans are reeling. Pearl Harbor was only 8 months ago, and the Japanese Empire has swept across the Pacific like wildfire. One island after another fell: Guam, Wake, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun seemed unstoppable. But in the dark holes of Washington and Pearl Harbor, a new plan was taking shape. It was time to hit back, even if the United States barely had its feet under it. The target, a little-known island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal, where Japanese engineers had begun building an airfield that could threaten the vital sea lanes between the US and Australia. Admiral Ernest King, gruff and impatient, pushed hard for an early counterstrike. The Marines, under General Alexander Vandergrift, were told to prepare for an amphibious assault, the first major American offensive of the war. But the truth was, no one was really ready. The Navy was short on carriers. The Marines were green, many just out of boot camp. The logistics were a nightmare. Still, on August 7, 1942, as dawn broke over the Pacific, a vast armada crept toward the dark outline of Guadalcanal. The men on those transports didn't know it yet, but they were about to step into a 6-month struggle that would test every limit of human endurance. The landing began under a pale sunrise. The Japanese, taken completely by surprise, scattered into the jungle. The Marines moved quickly, seized the half-built airstrip, and raised the flag. They named it Henderson Field, after a fallen pilot from Midway. Spirits were high. They thought they'd caught the enemy napping, that this was going to be one of those quick, clean victories you read about in the papers. But war, especially in the Pacific, had a cruel way of correcting optimism. That night, as the Marines dug foxholes into the wet, mosquito-infested soil, the sea erupted with the thunder of naval gunfire. The Japanese Navy struck back in the Battle of Savo Island, catching the American screening force off guard. In a single chaotic night, for Allied cruisers was sunk Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and Canberra. Hundreds of sailors died screaming in the black water. When the sun rose, the sea was slick with oil and bodies. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. By morning, the Marines realized something horrifying. The ships that had brought them were gone. Admiral Fletcher had pulled the carriers back, fearing another Japanese air assault. The supply ships fled with them. That left about 11,000 Marines stranded on an island surrounded by enemy waters, with barely enough food, ammunition, or medicine to last 2 weeks. The jungle closed in around them. The Japanese regrouped inland, and the nightmare began. It's hard to describe Guadalcanal unless you felt that kind of isolation. Imagine rain that never stopped, mud so deep it could swallow your boots, the stench of rot, of bodies, of malaria-sick men coughing under palm leaves. The jungle wasn't just a setting, it was an enemy. The heat broke men down, the insects feasted on them, and the darkness at night made even the bravest feel small. I once spoke to a Marine, years later, who told me the thing he remembered most wasn't the gunfire or the shelling. It was the sound of the jungle after midnight, when every rustle could be a soldier, a snake, or your imagination breaking under pressure. The first Japanese counterattack came fast. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi and Colonel Ichiki led waves of seasoned troops who believed, as their commanders did, that a single bold charge could sweep the Americans into the sea. The Japanese had been trained to fight like ghosts, move silent, strike hard, vanish into the green. On the night of August 21st, the Ichiki detachment, about 900 men, charged headlong across the sands of the Ilu River, what the Marines would call Alligator Creek. They came screaming banzai in the darkness, expecting panic. Instead, they ran into a wall of machine gun fire, mortars, and rifle bursts. When dawn came, the beach was carpeted with bodies. Only a handful of Japanese survived. The Marines buried their dead, burned what they could, and waited. They knew this was only the beginning. Supplies ran out faster than anyone predicted. The canned rations spoiled in the heat. Men lived off captured Japanese rice, sometimes crawling into abandoned enemy camps just to scavenge a handful. Malaria spread like wildfire. Their skin yellowed, their eyes sank, their tempers flared. Guadalcanal wasn't just a battlefield, it was a slow grind between will and exhaustion. Offshore, the struggle for control of the surrounding waters was constant and merciless. Every few nights, Japanese destroyers known as the Tokyo Express would slip down the slot under cover of darkness, bringing troops and supplies. The Americans tried to stop them, but the Japanese captains were masters of night fighting, using radarless precision and daring tactics. The seas around the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, named for the dozens of ships that went down their destroyers. Cruisers, even carriers littering the ocean floor. By September, both sides had dug in. The Japanese launched another assault at the Lunga perimeter, this time in the hills near Edson's Ridge. The Marines called it Bloody Ridge, and the name stuck for good reason. The Japanese came in waves, screaming through the rain and darkness, charging uphill against a line of exhausted, half-starved defenders. Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson and his raiders held the ridge with bayonets and grenades. When the ammo ran low, the fighting was close, savage, almost primal. When it was over, the ridge was carpeted with corpses. Edson's men had held, barely. That was the thing about Guadalcanal. There were no grand speeches, no orchestral heroics, just mud, blood, and men holding the line because they had no other choice. And somehow, through it all, Henderson Field stayed operational. Against all odds, those battered Marines and Navy mechanics kept the airstrip alive, patching it up after every bombardment, scavenging wrecks for parts. They called their ragtag air group the Cactus Air Force, after the island's codename. From battered Wildcats to patched-up SPDs, they flew daily, intercepting Japanese bombers, covering supply convoys, and taking a terrible beating. Many never came back. You could always tell a Cactus pilot. Lean, tired, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and strain. They lived on coffee, adrenaline, and the sound of engines. And yet, they made the difference. Every Japanese bomber shot down meant one less stick of dynamite dropped on the Marines below. Every transport sunk meant fewer reinforcements for the enemy. The pilots and the grunts depended on each other in a way few wars ever saw again. I remember one veteran pilot, decades after the war, telling me that Guadalcanal was where he stopped believing in luck. Luck runs out, he said. Skill and guts don't. By October, the Japanese were throwing everything they had at the island. The Battle of Cape Esperance, the bombardments that turned the jungle into an inferno, the desperate night assaults that ended in hand-to-hand chaos, each one chipped away at both sides. Reinforcements came, but so did disease. The jungle ate men alive. The Americans called it green hell, and for good reason. And yet, even in hell, there were moments of strange beauty. When the rain finally stopped, and the moonlight hit the water, you could almost forget the horror, almost, before we move deeper into the heart of the campaign, where the battles grow darker and the cost even higher. Take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a like if this story grips you the way it gripped the men who lived it. And drop a comment below. What do you think you'd have done, stranded on that island, half-starved and surrounded? I love hearing your thoughts. And it keeps this channel alive so we can keep these stories breathing. By late October, Guadalcanal wasn't just a battle, it was a fevered dream that refused to end. The Americans clung to Henderson Field like shipwreck survivors to driftwood, and the Japanese refused to let it go. The rain was relentless. The air reeked of rot and gun oil. The jungle had become a cemetery, and yet both sides were convinced that whoever held this forsaken island would decide the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese called it the Island of Death. The Marines, half joking, half bitter, called it Starvation Island. They weren't exaggerating. Supplies barely trickled in. Everything from ammunition to toilet paper had to come by sea. And every supply convoy meant another deadly gamble through the narrow channels of Iron Batom Sound. Japanese bombers pounded Henderson Field almost daily. The Marines grew used to it when the sirens wailed. They just ducked into foxholes and waited, muttering curses at the sky. The Japanese had started using long-range artillery too, firing from the far side of the Matanico River, and their shells screamed over the treetops like angry ghosts. The Japanese high command, humiliated by their earlier failures, decided it was time for a decisive strike. They poured thousands of fresh troops into the campaign, led by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakutoki. These weren't the exhausted remnants of earlier regiments, they were veterans of China and Malaya, confident and disciplined. Their orders were simple: take Henderson Field or die trying. Hyakutaka's men moved through the jungle in long columns, hacking through vines, dragging artillery by hand. They had no maps worth trusting, no food beyond what they carried, and the jungle consumed them just as it had their predecessors. But still, they came on. Their advance was watched constantly by marine patrols and native scouts, the Solomon Islanders, who risked their lives daily to carry messages and guide lost men. Without those scouts, the Americans might not have survived. The locals had their own reasons for helping. They'd seen what Japanese occupation meant: torture, beheadings, burned villages. So they guided the Marines through the jungle trails, whispering warnings in broken English, disappearing back into the green like spirits. When the Japanese launched their next attack in late October, the island seemed to tremble. At first came the artillery, then the low hum of aircraft. The Japanese had brought in their elite naval air units from Rabaul and Bougainville pilots, who'd fought since the early days of the war. The Cactus Air Force rose to meet them, outnumbered and running on fumes. The skies over Guadalcanal turned into swirling dogfight zeros darting between clouds. Wildcats clawing upward, tracers flashing in the sunlight. Down below, Marines craned their necks and cheered every Japanese plane that went down in smoke. On October 24th and 25th, the ground battle erupted. The Japanese attacked from the south, in the tangled jungle near the Lunga River. Thousands of men pushed forward, chanting, bayonets gleaming, determined to break through. The Marines, dug in behind makeshift wire and shallow foxholes, poured fire into the darkness. The fight raged all night. The Japanese came in waves, shouting Tenno Hika Banzai for the Emperor, but the Marines held. By dawn, the jungle was strewn with bodies. The Japanese had lost over 2,000 men in 2 nights. The American line had bent, but it hadn't broken. A Japanese officer captured later said he couldn't believe what he'd seen. The Americans did not run. Even when we charged and our comrades fell, they kept shooting. He said it with a kind of stunned respect. While the ground battles raged, the seas off Guadalcanal turned into chaos. In November came the great naval showdown, the Battle of Guadalcanal, a slugging match that would decide the campaign once and for all. The Japanese sent in a massive force: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports under Admiral Yamamoto's orders to obliterate Henderson Field and land reinforcements. The Americans, desperate but determined, sent in what ships they could, many of them damaged. Their crews exhausted. On the night of November 13th, under a moonless sky, the 2 fleets collided in one of the most savage night battles in history. The darkness was cut by flashes of gunfire, tracer arcs, and the thunder of explosions. Ships fired at silhouettes, friend and foe alike. Admiral Callaghan's flagship San Francisco fought at point-blank range. With the Japanese battleship Haie, shells ripped through decks. Men screamed as fires spread. The Haie's bridge was shredded by gunfire. Admiral Abe himself barely escaped. When dawn came, the sea was littered with wreckage. Both sides had paid dearly, but the Japanese bombardment had been stopped, at least for the moment. 2 nights later, they came again. The Americans had lost most of their cruisers, but the battleships Washington and South Dakota steamed in to face off against the Japanese. Battleship Kirishima. Radar gave the Americans their first real edge. In the blackness, Washington's big guns opened fire at ranges no human eye could see. Within minutes, Kirishima was burning from bow to stern. The ocean lit up like daylight. The Japanese turned away, beaten. Their transports, still loaded with troops, were left exposed. American planes found them at dawn and tore them apart. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned before they ever reached shore. That was the moment Guadalcanal turned. After that night, the Japanese never again seriously threatened Henderson Field. They still shelled it now and then, still tried small landings, but the tide had shifted. The Americans could finally bring in steady supplies, fresh food, ammunition, medicine, for the first time in months. Men could eat without rationing their last handful of rice. But don't let that make you think the suffering ended. It didn't. The victory came slow, painful, inch by inch. The Japanese soldiers who did make it ashore often starved to death in the jungle, abandoned by their navy, refusing to surrender. Some ate bark, some ate grass. Many died with their rifles clutched to their chests, facing the enemy that never came. I remember once talking to a Marine who'd been on patrol in December 42. He said they found a clearing deep in the jungle, half a dozen Japanese bodies laid out neatly, rifles stacked beside them. No wounds. They just sat down and died together. They weren't monsters, he said. They were just men who believed too much and got left behind. That's what made Guadalcanal different. It stripped away all the glamour of war. There were no clean victories, no grand parades, just men surviving another day. Marines, Seabees, Navy pilots, and Japanese infantry all trapped in the same green inferno, each convinced they were serving something greater. By January 1943, the Japanese High Command finally accepted the truth. The island was lost. Emperor Hirohito approved a withdrawal, the first major retreat of the Japanese war effort. Operation K, they called it. Over several nights in February, Japanese destroyers slipped down the slot and quietly evacuated what was left of their army. They pulled off a miracle of seamanship. Over 10,000 men rescued under the noses of the Americans, who didn't realize what was happening until it was done. When the sun rose on February 9, 1943, the Marines advanced cautiously and found the Japanese camps abandoned. The battle for Guadalcanal was over. 6 months of unrelenting horror. Over 7,000 Americans dead. More than 20,000 Japanese. Dozens of ships lost. Hundreds of planes gone. And an island that looked like it had been chewed up by the gods themselves. But it marked something vital, the first major Allied victory on land against Japan. Guadalcanal proved that the Japanese could be beaten, that they could bleed, that they weren't invincible after all. Even now, when you walk through the jungle, you can still find the traces: rusted helmets, bent dog tags, the twisted remains of a Zero half buried in vines. The jungle took it all back, but it didn't erase it. When I stood there myself, years later, with the cicadas buzzing and the ocean murmuring just beyond the trees, I felt something strange, a quiet respect. For both sides, For every man who walked into that green hell and didn't come out. Before we go deeper into the air war, the personal accounts, the desperate nights when men lost their minds from fever and fear. Pause the story for a second. If you're still with me, you're one of the rare few who really love history the way it's meant to be told. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Drop a like if you can feel the mud, the rain, and the courage it took to survive this place. And tell me in the comments what part of this story hits you hardest so far. It means more than you think. Even after the Japanese evacuation, Henderson Field still looked like a cratered moonscape. The Marines called it the world's ugliest airfield, and they weren't wrong. The runway was made of crushed coral and mud, littered with wrecked planes, oil drums, and half-buried bomb fragments. Every rainstorm turned it into soup, but somehow the planes kept flying. The Cactus Air Force, those tired, weary men with oil-stained faces, became the stuff of legend. They weren't some organized, gleaming air wing with spare parts and pristine hangars. They were a patchwork family of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots flying whatever could still get off the ground. You could hear them before you saw them. The throaty rumble of a Wildcat engine, the high whine of a P-400, or the deep, steady growl of a Dauntless diving into another run. They were under constant pressure every day. Another mission, another scramble against incoming bombers from Rabaul, another repair job in the rain. Some slept in their cockpits just to be ready faster. Some named their planes after sweethearts they hadn't seen in a year. Every morning, a few wouldn't come back. There was a saying around the airstrip: if you fly out of Henderson, you're halfway dead already. And they said it with a smile. That kind of gallows humor kept them sane. One pilot, Joe Foss, became the island's living legend. A South Dakota farm boy turned fighter ace. Foss led his small squadron of Wildcats with a mix of quiet steel and reckless courage. In just a few months, he racked up 26 confirmed kills, tying Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the Great War. But Foss wasn't some glory hound. He was just a guy who wanted to make sure his buddies saw another sunrise. He once said, "The hardest part wasn't shooting down the enemy, it was watching friends go missing in the smoke, and knowing you'd never find them again." And then there was John L. Smith, another Marine ace who flew so many missions his plane's skin peeled from the heat and salt. He once came back with his engine on fire, his canopy shattered, and his arm bleeding. But he still managed to belly land on the strip. He climbed out, coughed through the smoke, and muttered, "I think I'll skip lunch." The men laughed because that's all they could do. Life on Guadalcanal wasn't measured in days anymore, it was measured in missions. In meals, in how long you could go without getting bitten by another mosquito carrying malaria. You could always tell who'd been there the longest. The newbies still had color in their cheeks. The veterans looked like shadows, gaunt, quiet, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. The Japanese airmen, too, were facing their own hell. The once invincible Zeros were losing ground, their pilots stretched thin. Many were veterans of China and the early Pacific Blitz, men who'd flown since before Pearl Harbor. They were still skilled, deadly even, but they were now flying from distant bases, covering immense distances, and losing precious fuel and friends in every engagement. The attrition was chewing them up. The pilots who had once looked down on their enemies now found themselves flying home over empty seas, low on fuel, praying the weather would hold. There's a tragic beauty in that kind of courage. Both sides were young, proud, and certain they were fighting for something noble. And both were slowly realizing the Pacific was a beast that devoured belief. The ground crews worked miracles just to keep the planes airborne. With no spare parts, they cannibalized wrecks, patched bullet holes with tin, and used sandpaper to smooth cracked propellers. They called themselves cactus mechanics. When a plane came in riddled with holes, they'd slap it back together, pat the nose, and say, "You're good for one more, old girl." Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they weren't. At night, when the shelling died down and the jungle insects took over, you could hear the quiet murmur of men talking in the dark, swapping rumors, letters, and fears. Someone might strum a guitar. Someone else would curse the rain. Every now and then, a flare would light up the horizon, and everyone would freeze, expecting the next raid. Sleep came in bursts. By December 1942, reinforcements had arrived, army units relieving the worn-out Marines. The newcomers looked at the veterans with a mix of awe and disbelief. The old hands were rail-thin, their uniforms hanging off them, their boots rotted, their skin covered in sores. One soldier wrote in his diary that the Marines looked like they'd come straight from hell's own mouth. The army took over the fighting on the western front of the island, pushing toward Mount Austin, the Galloping Horse Ridge, and the Gaifu stronghold, names that meant nothing to the world, but everything to the men who died there. The Japanese dug in with fanatical determination, carving tunnels into hillsides, stringing machine gun nests through the jungle. The Americans advanced yard by yard, under constant sniper fire and artillery bursts that seemed to come from nowhere. Every tree, every rock could hide a rifle. One private, years later, said the worst sound wasn't the gunfire, it was the silence before it. The jungle went quiet, he said, and you knew something was watching you. Sometimes you fired first. Sometimes you didn't get the chance. The Japanese soldiers fought like ghosts. Many had already accepted they wouldn't leave the island alive. Their rations were gone. Their uniforms hung in tatters. They carried grenades not to fight, but to use on themselves when cornered. When the Americans finally overran their positions, they often found notes written in blood or carved into wood, farewell messages to mothers, wives, and emperors. It's easy to forget, looking back, that every nameless figure on a casualty list once had a favorite song, a dream, a family waiting somewhere that never saw them again. I've read the letters some of them wrote before they vanished. One Japanese lieutenant wrote to his fiancée, saying, "The jungle is thick, the night is long, but I do not fear. If I die here, know that I was not afraid. I think of your face when the rain falls." That kind of quiet humanity buried inside a war that had stripped everything away stays with you. Even victory tasted bitter. By the time the Americans officially declared the island secured in February 1943, there wasn't much left to secure. The jungle was scorched, the rivers clogged with debris, the beaches littered with rusting wreckage. The air still stank of cordite and decay. The surviving Japanese soldiers gaunt. Hollow-eyed skeletons stumbled out of the trees to surrender or simply collapse. Many never even had the strength to raise their hands. When the Marines boarded their transports to leave, they were too tired to celebrate. One of them wrote home, "We didn't cheer. We just sat there, staring at the ocean. It was over, but it didn't feel like winning. It just felt like we'd survived." And maybe that's the heart of Guadalcanal, the difference between victory and survival. It wasn't some grand triumph of strategy or firepower. It was a war of endurance, of willpower. The Japanese had believed their spirit, their Bushido, could overcome any hardship. The Americans discovered something of their own, that stubborn, quiet refusal to quit even when everything goes to hell. When you think about it, that's what makes this story timeless. It's not about who had the better planes or the sharper bayonets. It's about human beings pushed to the absolute edge, and somehow they didn't break. I remember an old Marine telling me once, in a shaky voice, Guadalcanal wasn't a battle. It was a test. The jungle tested us. The hunger tested us. The Japanese tested us. And somehow we passed. But we left a part of ourselves there. He paused then, took a deep breath, and said quietly, "You can still hear it when it rains." That line's haunted me ever since. Because he was right. When it rains on Guadalcanal, the sound is heavy like footsteps of the past. Before we move into the final stretch of this story, where we'll look at what the victory meant, the lives it changed, and how it shaped the rest of the Pacific War, take a second to breathe with me. If you're still here, you're part of that rare group who cares enough to keep history alive. So do me a favor, hit subscribe if you haven't yet. Give this video a like if it pulled you in. And share it with someone who loves these forgotten corners of history. Drop your thoughts below. I read every one of them. And I want to know how this story lands with you.